Dan Bullock and I landed in Vietnam together. We were assigned to the same unit. Second platoon of Fox Company had lost most of a platoon. So they took replacements and put them in this one platoon, second platoon. There were only 11 men left after a Mother's Day mortar attack. So we were in the rear at Anwa Fire Base, and that's we didn't go out to the bush. We were waiting for the men to come back. And in that time, we got to know each other, not too well because Dan was protecting a secret. But we did talk. I befriended him because the men who were in the field, who came back to the rear, didn't like Dan for some reason. They didn't know what it was, but they were kind of angry with him. He didn't do anything. He didn't speak. He was okay. He and I would spar. He and I would go to chow together. And I felt like a big brother to him. And I outranked the other men. I was a lance corporal, they were PFCs. So I would keep them from harassing him.
At this point in the war, the troops that were fighting, the American troops, Marines and soldiers and airmen and naval personnel, were a mix of drafted people and people who had volunteered. If you, let's say, entered the service and you were 18 or 19, you'd go to basic training, and you would go through the system that would, turn you into, basically, a private or the equivalent of a private first class within a year or so. Now, a lot of those soldiers or Marines were, in fact, sent to Vietnam pretty much out of their, advanced infantry training. So they hadn't been in the service probably more than a year or so, and they were put into a dangerous situation almost from the moment they stepped off the plane. However, they weren't simply thrown in as cannon fodder. It wasn't callous, in that sense. It wasn't a meat grinder. The United States military was doing everything that it could to ensure that those young men would be successful. For a lot of these young Marines like Dan Bullock, it might have been several weeks before they actually saw action. But when they did start going out on patrols and start participating in these operations, they were expected to pull their weight, from the moment they stepped outside the wire. So it is hard to wrap your head around, I think, how disorienting that would have been, especially someone, let's say, from maybe a sheltered environment or a privileged environment or an inner city. Usually it took several months to bring those new troops, up to speed, and everyone, recognized that you got to go easy on them in the beginning. Usually after about 3 months or so, they would get up to speed, and usually between 3 to 9 months is when they would have peak efficiency.
He would go out on these small patrols. We'd check out bunkers. We'd check the wire to make sure the enemy didn't cut it. We'd be on bunker duty at night, filling sandbags during the day, and all this until the company came back. When they came back from the Arizona Territory, they were in no mood for new men, myself included. They did not like breaking in new men because we didn't know the sights, sounds, smells, or what to do during an attack. These are all combat veterans. And for some reason, which we found out later, it was Dan did everything he was told to do, and yet he was the last person picked for bunker duty or whatever. And the day of the attack, he and I were sparring, and he dislocated my thumb. So I couldn't use my rifle that night. So I was sent to guard tanks. He went to the bunkers, And that night, the enemy broke in. They used satchel charge, just sacks of explosives. They tossed onto the bunkers or into the bunkers and blew them up, and that then the other ones could infiltrate. They were trying to blow up stores of ammunition, like artillery shells, and if they could, planes or whatever. They didn't really get through. Some of them broke through. One of them actually made it into the regimental area. But Dan's bunker and everyone in it, the 4 men were in it, Bunn, Honeycutt, Eggensdorfer, and Bullock, were all killed, probably instantly, because none of them got out of the bunker. The enemy that got over the bunker, we heard later, had fired into it just to make sure they had killed everyone in it. So there possibility of gunshot wounds and explosion. So none of our men could get to that bunker because they kept the enemy away, but there was a trench line behind it, and that's where the men were fighting from. So in the morning, we had to hold positions, or they did. I was still at the tanks, and another unit of Marines came in and removed the bodies. So none of us ever saw him, or Eggensdorfer, Bunn, and Honeycutt. We didn't see the bodies. So no one knew exactly what happened. In all these years, we get together at our reunions and we try to piece together several incidents that happened in Vietnam. We go over and over and over it, trying to figure out what exactly happened. In each reunion, someone new comes in with their information, and it's pretty much the same thing I just said. It was a satchel charge, rifle fire, machine gun fire. And one of the men blown off the bunker, on top of the bunker, used a .22 caliber pistol to shoot a sapper. So it was point blank combat. So that's the whole thing. There was something about him that made me want to protect him when the other men were just outright aggressive toward him. So he and I were friends, although we didn't speak much. We spent a lot of time writing home. He didn't share his letters with anyone. But I thought this was normal behavior. I hadn't yet been in combat. A few weeks after he was killed, a reporter came in. The big story was on the front page of the New York Times. 15-year-old is killed. Then we realized, it all just fell into place that Dan was 15. He had enlisted at 14. He had gone through boot camp at 14. To me, that makes it amazing that any human alive can make it through boot camp at 14 is really impressive. That he held a secret is also impressive. But it explained why I felt like he was a younger brother, and others felt like he wasn't supposed to be there. He didn't belong there.
The day I found out that Dan was killed, I was in Cuba in a foxhole. There was a Marine that got a newspaper from home, and he was in boot camp with us. And his mother sent him the New York Times without knowing, I guess, that he knew Dan, and he was on the front cover. So he ran over to my hole with tears in his eyes. He's crying. He said, "Look, Mac, look." And I looked at it. When I saw it, I cried. And that was horrifying, because nobody knew until that point how old he was. When I realized he was 14 years old, I had this terrible feeling. And then when that Marine said to me later on, not that same one, but, "You ever thought if you hadn't helped him, he might still be alive?" So I have been touched by that from that day on. I knew that there was something I had to do. I went on a mission to find his family. It took my wife and I 22 years to find his family and his burial site. And then when we found him and found that he was buried without a headstone for over 31 years, then the mission was to make sure he had a headstone.
Not long after, recognition for PFC Dan Bullock came from an unexpected source.
I got a call from Sally Jessup Raphael about the headstone. She read in the paper about my efforts to get Dan recognition, and he was buried without a headstone. Her head of security, Mr. Al Bland, is a combat Marine, Vietnam. He took the story to Sally with tears in his eyes, I'm told, and told her, we have to help this guy. So I got a call from their officers, and they wanted to know if she could pay for the headstone. My wife and I and the rest of our foundation led 2,000 people, Marines, and other branches of the service from Brooklyn all the way to Goldsboro, North Carolina, with police escorts in every state to put it on his grave.